Hello, everyone, and welcome to Agulhas Current Affairs, a marine science podcast set in Southern Africa with me as one of your hosts, Dr. Jonas Kirsten of Geekoscopy Media, alongside
Dr. Nelson Miranda of Argonaut Science. And today we are talking about topics of diversity, isn't it? It's a hot topic, isn't it? Diversity.
Yeah, in many different connotations. I suppose you had a connotation in your head when you heard that term, but when it comes to biology, diversity, it's kind of similar to other connotations, but for us it's very quantifiable. It means certain things in a lot of different terms and definitions and kind of ideas that a biologist might think about when they think of diversity and biodiversity.
Yeah, and all of those ideas are actually based on something that we spoke about in our previous episode. The very important unit of biology called the species.
Yeah, for sure. So, well, definitely for ecology, I suppose that's the basic unit, because we also talked in another episode about DNA, which is even there's a unit below that. But when it comes to one functional form of ecology and animals and plants and fungi and stuff living together, that is a species. But species don't exist by themselves. Like, they're not an island. It kind of exists on their own. And even like in some of the most treacherous and very hardy places on the planet, you're going to have multiple species living there. Probably bacteria when it comes to like very, very terrible environments like volcanoes and like the Antarctic and the Arctic.
Extreme.
But we're going to be discussing, like, when you put those organisms and plants and animals together, what are the kind of terminology, and kind of what it means from a quantifiable way, and how we do science on those things, in biology and biodiversity in particular.
Yeah, so it's like species number. Number of species is the simple number of each species that you find in a place. And now species A will have an abundance of 10 individuals, species B will have an abundance of 100 individuals, the next species will have abundance of 1,000,000 individuals, and that's what we're talking about when we talk about species abundance.
So, on the other hand, when you do talk about the number of different species, then we're talking about something called species richness. So that's the term. If you hear species richness, that's just the total number of species that might exist in a particular whatever area or ecosystem that you're counting. And when you put those two things together, that's where the term biodiversity comes from, or species diversity. So when we talk about in jargon terms, by species diversity, it is both how many different species there are and the numbers within each species in total.
Yeah, the numbers of individual organisms within the individual living organisms within each species. And together, that's an index. Index means an indication. We actually can calculate, taking in both of those variables, and then the mathematics comes in, and sometimes the confusion comes in as well. But you can calculate
too deep
an indication. We can actually measure, but it's about measurement. Measurement is why we are going into the different things.
It's a very complex statistical model.
It can be complex.
Anything about a Shannon-Wiener model or something like that? That's what species diversity is referring to.
That's one of the indices, one of many. But that's one of the common ones in biology, for sure.
Yeah. So when you talk about like diversity and the number of species, the abundance, and the different species that might inhabit the area, there's also two other. It's getting complicated again. Two other different indices. Well, not necessarily indices, because those are the terms that we use like when we're counting stuff, right, and calculating. But also you can talk about in general terms of if there's a lot of a certain specific organism together, we call that a population, right? And different populations kind of like living together, that we call like a community. So if you're talking about if a scientist is talking about one specific organism or animal or plant, whatever, in an area, and they talk about a population, that's what they mean by population, right? Whereas a community, it's kind of like a community of different people living together, but it's different species
Yeah,
and different populations within that species living in
yeah.
a certain area.
It's definitely very area specific, because usually populations are also, um, you know, they are sometimes it's an arbitrary sort of definition when you say, okay, it's the population within a certain area that we decided as the scientist, or we decided as the human being, that's the area, that's a population that belongs in that area. But sometimes it also has to do with whether different groups of the same species actually interact with each other, the degree to which they interact with each other. So if they are far away from each other, if they are separate, and there's a big, barrier in between, usually we tend to call those two different populations. Even though now and again there might be a little bit of a link, we like to maybe separate those two. And again, it has to do with the application of biodiversity, isn't it? Because it might be important to make a distinction between a group of organisms from the same species living in area A and another group living in another area, right?
Mm, for sure, it's like we said in our previous episode, like there's somebody has to like draw like a line in the sand as to what you're talking about, right? So sometimes like a lot of animals will also be like moving between ecosystems and moving between regions and like interbreeding and stuff. So obviously, like in a like more zoomed out level, it's very difficult to kind of delineate when you talk about a community exactly where the community fits. So you kind of have to like arbitrarily draw a line in the sand and be like, okay, this is where this community of whatever
Yeah,
ecosystem or fish community or plant community or whatever it is. So
yeah,
it is arbitrary, but also it's a term we have to do when we're quantifying things and trying to figure out like what is there and how much is there, because that's very important for stuff we'll talk about later in this episode.
yeah,
But before we get into why we do all that counting and things, because we could kind of like jump straight into all the terminology, and we'll get to why we do all of that. But also, like you would have learned probably in like high school, maybe in primary school, about something called like a food web or a food chain, and that's different from what a community is, because a community will be kind of all of that organism or plant or animal, whatever, living together. But a food web is generally what's like kind of eating each other, right? So it might look similar, but a food web is going to be more an indication of, okay, this animal is being, or this kind of like plant is being eaten by that animal is being eaten by that plant, and you kind of get this kind of web
yeah,
of what's eating each other. And like
yeah,
we spoke about I think in the previous episode, but like some things can like cannibalize and eat themselves, but there are different stages in their life, so it makes it very complicated. But I think it's important to like delineate. You generally don't get like a food chain where it's like one um
like
like one line of things. Like generally when you get something like that, it means something is very wrong, or you're in a very like very harsh environment naturally. um but that is separate from what a community is.
yeah. And when we're talking about food chains and food webs, it's in the name. We're talking about food, what eats what,
Yeah.
and the relationship. Is something eaten or being eaten? And you need to understand that, because food is also life, isn't it? And again, we're measuring these things, and we'll reveal why we're measuring these things, or why we might be measuring these things. And now, also, it's worth mentioning that sometimes we can only measure what's practical to measure. This also may influence, how we make distinctions between different populations, or between different stages in the food web. Um, a lot of the linear food webs that we measure sometimes is because we didn't detect any other organisms around that are also maybe part of that food web, and then we think it's just a simple food chain. So it's possible that we miss
For
things
sure,
sometimes
100%.
when we are measuring.
Um, so I think that, like, talking about food, I think is actually a good segue into why it's important to actually count all these things. Because one of the important things about why you would want to even look at a food chain or a food web or a community or a population is that you might want to use that for food. It might be a particular resource, like, let's say, like a fish, or like um, you're harvesting berries or
Yeah,
whatever from a particular area. So keeping track and knowing like what your impact is on that population or the community or that ecosystem is very important, and it leads to why we need to count these sort of things and do surveys and figure out what the community is like looking like right now, because generally us human beings have an impact on these ecosystem. One, because we need them for something like um, harvesting resources, or we having an impact on them, like maybe polluting the environment. So ecosystem services that they provide to us is probably the main reason why we would want to kind of identify and count the different number of species, how many there is left. This is a very important thing in like fisheries science, because fisheries, I think, is one of the things that's very difficult to like keep an eye on. So we have to like use modeling, but it still means we have to go out and collect data all the time on these catches, so that we can kind of plot out how much of these fishes are left, so that
yeah,
government or management can decide whether, okay, we need to close this fishery now because we've over harvested.
yeah, yeah. We all, as human beings, we are interested in healthy food and in a healthy environment, and those two go together, because healthy food comes from healthy environments, isn't it? That's why we may want to find out what's eating what, so we know what the basis is, that we should be protecting, so that the next layer, the next organism that eats that is protected, so that then the next organism, like, might be something that we eat ourselves and we depend on it for our livelihood. So you see, it's very important for us to understand that. And the only way we're going to understand it is to measure it, really, and that's so we can show that it's a measurable thing. And if I measure it, I get a similar result than if the next person measures it. Then we know that we're close to reality, so we can all agree, on the same measurement. And if we all agree on a measurement and we want things to change, the changes can be based on that measurement. So I measure the number of fish. I see the number of fish are declining. What do I want? I want more fish. It isn't it? I want maybe double the fish of what I measured before. At least we have a benchmark. Why? Because we measure the number of us. We are the human species. you know, we're part of that. We're part of that web.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then
I mean, we
when
do a census every now and then.
we do the census, and you see, if we then measure all of that, we understand the connections. We start to understand the flow of the food, the flow of the energy, and then we see that's all linked to the backdrop of this diversity. You know, so a food chain, right? For example, might be a very low diversity, system, whereas a food web, it's more likely to be a very high diversity system, and then we need to understand like which biodiversity systems might be more favorable, for a healthy ecosystem, for a healthy environment, for a healthy, lifestyle for us as humans. So really,
Mm.
we're taking care of ourselves when we measure and pay attention to the environment around us and to the diversity of
Yes,
life around us.
for sure. And tracking that change is something that's also important, because when we are kind of having impacts, or even natural impacts on ecosystems, we got to figure out whether they can actually withstand any change, whether they can kind of like bounce back from disturbances. So that's where ecosystem resistance and like resilience comes in.
It's like it's important to make the distinction between when something is resistant to changes or when something is resilient once a change occurs and has its impact. So in other words, resilience is more about bouncing back, you know not so much resisting the change but going along with it and then bouncing back, whereas resistance is more about not allowing the change to affect you, you know so when
For
it
sure,
comes
100%.
to yeah, we'll do maybe an episode on ecosystems, directly, and how
Yeah,
ecosystems are important for us and what sort of services they are providing for us.
for sure, for
um,
sure. I'm going to
but
link down in that description a paper that you sent me, Nelson,
hmm,
from Frontiers.
for young
Is it? Yeah,
minds,
Frontiers for Young
frontiers for
Minds.
young minds. I really like this journal, guys. I think we should all be reading this journal. Why? Because this journal is edited by kids. And kids know
That's
what's going
interesting.
on. This kids
Yeah.
really know what's going on. And when they are the editors, they don't take any nonsense. They ask us scientists to keep it simple and to explain things plainly. So I really like this paper that's in the link. It's entitled Protecting Our Oceans and Why the Definition of Biodiversity Matters. So basically, there are examples of different takes or perspectives on biodiversity, and each of these perspectives is really important because it tells a different story, so that we may understand what may be going on in an ecosystem. And why would we want to do that? Because we're interested in protecting the ecosystem, conserving it. We're interested in an ecosystem that continues to function, so that health is maintained, so that we are healthy as well.
For sure. And I'll link that paper in the description. I think we'll talk about it maybe in a bit more detail in our ecosystem episode. But I think that was a good little dipping our toes into what biodiversity actually means and some of the relative terms people might come across in the context of biodiversity. If we missed out on any terms, I think you can let us know on Twitter at Agulhas Current or at Agulhas Current Affairs and other platforms. Or you can tweet at me if you're particularly angry at Kikosubi. What about you, Nelson?
They can also find Argonaut Science in the webs. We are present in most different forms of social media. And yeah, stay resilient. In other words, if there's more biodiversity, there's more chances you can bounce back. Isn't that so?
Exactly. Yeah, it's a good tagline. Stay resilient.
Stay resilient.
Otherwise, cheers.
Cheers from my side too.